Right now, Iran is playing a high-stakes game of chicken and going through some massive internal changes. Honestly, it's all a direct result of those huge security failures back in the summer of 2025. You know how a national crisis can totally reshuffle who's in charge? Well, for Tehran, the surprise military moves by Israel and the US in June of 2025 were a brutal reality check that showed just how broken things were. Before this 2026 naval standoff and all the crazy oil market swings, the very foundation of Iran's defense was basically torn apart by two overlapping operations: Lion's Power and Midnight Hammer. In the early hours of June 13th, 2025, the Israeli Air Force kicked off Operation Lion's Power. This wasn't just a border scuffle, it was a massive breach of Iranian sovereignty. This wasn't just a minor tactical strike, it was a high-level decapitation. In a tiny 12-day window, over 400 senior military personnel and more than a dozen top scientists, including nuclear program managers, were taken out. They used a mix of precision-guided weapons and saturation attacks, specifically designed to exploit the huge gaps in Iran's air defense and intel networks. For the first time since the Iran-Iraq War, the leadership in Tehran faced a real existential threat. It went right past their proxy networks and hit the very heart of their domestic military-industrial complex. The second shock hit on June 21st, 2025, when the US launched Operation Midnight Hammer. This one went straight for the toughest parts of Iran's nuclear program, specifically the sites at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. The sheer scale of Midnight Hammer was historic. We're talking over 125 aircraft and the longest B-2 Spirit stealth bomber mission since the year 2001. 7 B-2 bombers, backed by a huge fleet of F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, and electronic warfare planes, slipped through Iranian airspace to drop 14 GBU-57 MOPs. This was the first time they ever used that 30,000-pound bunker buster in combat. It was specially designed to hit the Fordo facility, which is buried so deep underground that normal strikes can't even touch it. Right after the strikes, a massive intelligence gap started to show. While the Pentagon and President Trump initially claimed the facilities were completely and totally wiped out, leaked reports from the DIA and Israeli military intel suggested things weren't that simple. Evidence started popping up that Iran might have moved the core components like the centrifuges and enriched uranium just before the strikes. So most of the destruction was actually limited to the power systems and buildings on the surface. When it clicked that the nuclear program was only delayed by a few months instead of years, it set the stage for all the drama. That realization led directly to the renewed tensions and the 2026 Armada crisis. Everyone quickly realized one thing. Under that kind of high-pressure military strike, Iran's dual military structures, the IRGC and the regular army, known as the Artesh, just couldn't work together. This total failure in coordinated defense forced them into an urgent, top-to-bottom institutional overhaul. Historically, the IRGC has been the golden child of the clerical establishment. They've got their own massive economic empire and their own independent military-industrial system. On the flip side, the regular military, the Artesh, has been suffering from a chronic lack of funding for a long time. This split created a really weird situation. The IRGC had all the cash but lacked deep professional expertise, while the Artesh had the trained personnel but no working equipment. Sometimes they couldn't even pay their soldiers. To fix this mess, the Supreme National Security Council pulled out Article 176 of the Constitution on August 3rd, 2025, to set up a Central Defense Committee. This committee is chaired by the reformist president, Masoud Pezeshkian. The whole point was to centralize command and control, tying the resources of the IRGC and the Artesh together into one unified strategy. Then they appointed Ali Larijani as the secretary of the council. He's a pragmatist with deep ties to both the religious leaders and the military. Picking him signaled a big shift. Defense management was finally becoming more professional rather than just being about ideology. Setting up this defense committee was also a slick move to sideline the radical reformists, the ones who wanted to just give in to Western demands right away. President Pezeshkian teamed up with Larijani and the conservatives on security stuff, which basically split the reformist camp right down the middle. The moderates wanted slow internal change and a tough military, but the radicals, led by guys like former President Hassan Rouhani, kept pushing to lift sanctions at any cost, no matter what. This ended up making the radicals total political outcasts. By January 2026, they were actually arrested on charges of trying to mess with the country's stability from the inside. The rearmament program that kicked off in late 2025 came with a massive price tag, and it was the Iranian people who really felt the squeeze. In September of 2025, the Iranian parliament approved a one-time military spend of over $46 billion. That's more than 10% of the country's entire GDP. The budget set aside $2 billion for buying foreign defense systems, plus another $1.5 billion taken straight out of the oil sector. But here's the thing. Iran's total annual income in foreign currency was only about $10 billion. Spending that much money meant the math just didn't add up. It was totally unsustainable. To pay for all those weapons, the government started cranking up the money printers and diverting resources. This straight up triggered a hyperinflationary collapse that ruined the economy. The Iranian rial tanked by over 60%, hitting a record low. It got to the point where it took 1.47 million rials just to get one single US dollar. Then came the shortages and sky-high prices for basic stuff. That was the spark that ignited the massive riots sweeping the country in December of 2025. These protests started out of pure economic desperation, but they quickly turned into something bigger. People started demanding real political change and a move toward a secular state. The Pezeshkian government played it both ways with the riots. They used a mix of iron fist suppression and some desperate economic moves to keep people quiet. They made a massive move by killing off the subsidized exchange rate system. For decades, companies linked to the IRGC were getting dollars at crazy low rates, creating about $18 billion a year in easy middleman profits. By ending this, the government basically snatched the bag back from the IRGC and used that cash to fund a huge new subsidy program for regular people. They started handing out 10 to 20 million rials a month to nearly 88 million residents. It was a last-ditch effort to calm everyone down and stop the regime from collapsing during the peak of that 2025 winter unrest. At the end of the day, oil is the absolute lifeline for the Iranian state. We're talking over half of their total export money coming from that one thing. Despite the crazy military pressure and the maximum pressure campaign from the second Trump administration, Iranian oil production has stayed surprisingly tough. As of early 2026, their production has stabilized at around 3.3 million barrels per day. But here's the catch. Making money off that oil is a whole different story. They have to rely on a sanctions-dodging network that's getting more and more expensive to keep running. Iran's export strategy really boils down to one single dominant customer, China. To keep the oil flowing, Tehran's been forced to offer massive discounts to those independent Chinese refineries. How cheap are we talking? On average, they're selling it for $8 below global benchmarks for every single barrel. That's a huge cut just to keep the cash coming in. But even with the discounts, the road is getting blocked. Back in September of 2025, the US hit Chinese logistics hubs like the Haye Dongjiakou terminal with sanctions. This caused Iranian crude imports at key ports to crash by 65%. This really showed just how shaky the Dark Fleet logistics network actually is. This underground shipping system is incredibly fragile and can't handle that kind of targeted pressure. Iran's fiscal health is in real trouble because of a massive break-even gap. While global oil prices have been hanging between $60 and $70, the IMF estimates that Iran needs oil to hit $163 a barrel just to balance its budget. Since the math doesn't add up, they've been forced to rely on shady financial channels and barter deals, basically trading oil for resources, especially with Venezuela. Leaked documents from late 2025 show that Iranian projects in Venezuela's Paraguana refining center totaled roughly $4.7 billion. This is a strategic move to swap their refining expertise for a backdoor into global markets, trying to find a way to bypass all those sanctions. Things took a much darker turn just yesterday. On January 28th, 2026, President Donald Trump announced that a massive armada is now heading straight for the Iranian coast. This fleet is led by the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. The president described them as ready, willing, and able to get the job done with speed and violence, unless Tehran agrees to a fair and equitable nuclear deal. Trump's rhetoric specifically pointed back to those midnight hammer strikes from 2025. He gave a chilling warning, saying that the next attack will be far worse. The market reaction was immediate and reflexive. Brent crude prices surged past the $70 mark, reaching a 5-month high as traders started factoring in the possibility of a total blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most critical energy choke point. It handles between 21 and 23 million barrels of oil every single day. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 20 to 21% of all the crude oil traded globally. Any real threat to this waterway triggers what we call a geopolitical risk premium. It can add $5 to $10 to the price of a barrel, regardless of the actual supply levels. The Iranian response, coming from Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, was a mix of standing his ground and asking for fair talks. He said Iran is open to a deal that protects their right to peaceful nuclear tech, but they won't talk while there's a gun pointed at their head. He also pointed out that Iran's military has its fingers on the trigger, ready to react to any kind of aggression. Behind all that public posturing, mediators from Turkey and other regional powers are reportedly working hard to find a face-saving way out of this mess. However, according to U.S. officials, there hasn't been any real progress as of late January 2026. Beyond the military and the money, the most profound changes in Iran are actually happening on a social level right in people's daily lives. That 12-day war and the economic crash that followed basically tore up the social contract between the religious leadership and the youth. There's a huge trend towards secularization now. Honestly, the younger generation is just over the old religious rules and wants to live a more modern life. To keep a total revolution from blowing up, the government's been forced to play along and actually loosen its grip a bit. After those riots in 2025, the morality police basically stopped showing up. They've pretty much given up on enforcing the headscarf laws in any real way. What's even crazier is that the government is actually sponsoring these things called happiness concerts. They're free outdoor music events designed to boost national unity. In September of 2025, over 1 million people showed up to these pop concerts. They featured singers and genres that used to be totally banned or suppressed. This whole shift shows that the regime is moving away from strict religious rules. To stay in power, they're leaning way more into good old-fashioned nationalism rather than religious dogma. This whole social makeover is tied right into that big succession crisis that's looming over everything. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is pushing 90 now. Then you've got the trauma from that bunker period back in 2025. He actually had to go completely off the grid and cut all electronic comms just to avoid being taken out by Israeli strikes. After all that, the question of who's next in line isn't just about politics anymore. It's become a literal matter of national survival. There's more and more talk inside Iran that the religious leaders might actually pick a non-cleric to take over. They're looking at guys like Ali Larijani to lead a new government that's built on being proud of being Iranian, rather than just sticking to the old religious rules. It's a survival move, plain and simple. They want to align the regime with how the people are actually feeling, moving toward a more modern, secular vibe to keep things from blowing up. In short, they're trying to turn Iran into a country that looks more like the other nationalist powers in the region, shifting away from that strict religious identity. Looking at where we are right now, in early 2026, things are incredibly shaky. It's basically a high-stakes game of chicken where everything is on the line. We've got 3 big things crashing into each other. The US Navy is breathing down their necks at sea, Iran is going through a massive internal shakeup, and the global oil market is as fragile as glass. This whole mess has created a scenario where, over the next 6 months, we're likely to see one of 3 primary outcomes. First off, an escalation scenario is still very much on the table. If the Pezeshkian Larijani government can't really budge on uranium enrichment, that Armada might actually be put to work. Their mission would likely be an even bigger version of Midnight Hammer. We're talking about targeting not just nuclear sites, but the actual oil infrastructure that keeps the Iranian state's heart beating. Bloomberg thinks that if Iranian production completely drops off the map, we could see Brent crude hitting $91 a barrel by the 4th quarter of 2026. Second, we've got a managed tension scenario. This is actually the most likely outcome. It's like both sides are walking a tightrope, trying to keep things under control without actually letting them explode. In this model, Iran offers some token concessions, basically throwing them a bone. They might let the IAEA inspectors in more often, or put their high-level enrichment on ice for a bit. This would be in exchange for the Armada backing off a little. It lets everyone breathe, even though the real deep-down conflict is still very much there, totally unresolved. This would likely keep oil prices in the $65 to $75 range. Traders have already baked in a war premium, so the price isn't going back to normal anytime soon. Finally, the internal collapse of the religious regime is the real wild card in this whole story. I mean, when the exchange rate hits 1.47 million rials to the dollar and you start arresting popular guys like Javad Zarif, you're basically looking at a political pressure cooker that's about to blow. On top of that, the obvious move toward a secular nationalist successor could trigger a second wave of riots, and this time, it could be a lot more violent than before. If things go south like that, Tehran won't be able to keep up its tough regional posture anymore. They'll be too busy trying to stop their own house from burning down. To wrap things up, the crisis from 2025 to 2026 has totally transformed Iran. It went from being a stable religious state to a fractured nationalist country that's just fighting for its economic and physical survival. Even though some parts of the world have plenty of oil right now, the global market is still basically a hostage to the geography of the Persian Gulf. Everything depends on the strategic moves being made right now, whether it's in the underground bunkers of Tehran or the Situation Room over in Washington. These next 6 months are going to be the decider. We'll either see Iran emerge as a modern, secular regional power, or watch it turn into a failed state right in the heart of the world's energy corridor. Make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe right now. I'll see you in the next deep dive.